Hey everybody. Wanted to talk to you today about a story of the murder of two people in London last week. Two people who committed to the idea of rehabilitation were at a conference on the subject in London. I want to talk to you about how within 24 hours, the murder of those two people was politically exploited, including by the UK Prime Minister, a man named Boris Johnson, in the middle of an election campaign to divert from other issues and to whip up emotions, to whip up a knee-jerk reaction, which would not only be that there was no such thing as rehabilitation, but that he should be supported in his campaign as Prime Minister by coming down on the heads of terrorists and all those who would commit evil upon us. I want to talk to you about those important issues of rehabilitation and security and justice, but how they were not only pushed aside, but stomped upon by that exploitation. And I want to talk to you about, in the midst of all this, how allies of Boris Johnson, including my experience with a national radio station this week, would go so far as to denounce, criticize, even trash the father of one of those victims. Last Saturday, near London Bridge, a man named Usman Khan, a man who had served an 8-year sentence for trying to raise funds for a madrasa to encourage terrorism in Pakistan, was at a conference on rehabilitation. During that conference, he pulled out a machete and he started attacking people with it. Two of the staff that were working at the event, Jack Merritt and Saskia Jones, would be killed. Others would flee before the attacker was subdued by a chef from a local restaurant waving a narwhal tusk, and by a convicted murderer, a man who was there as a rehabilitated offender at the conference. Usman Khan was then shot and killed by police. Very soon after the event, what I expected would happen began to unfold. Various parties began to comment on the episode, not just the Conservative Party, the ruling Conservative Party, but also members of the Labour Party. But it was the ruling Conservative Party that began to put out the message to media outlets that they would be not only looking at this, but they would be looking at in other words, putting out the idea that from now on, all terrorists should serve their full sentences, putting out the implication that it was someone else who was to blame for Usman Khan for being released 8 years into a 16-year sentence, and that they would remedy the injustice. The next morning, a Sunday, Boris Johnson appeared on a BBC morning discussion show with a man named Andrew Marr. Now, there's an important backstory to this, that for days before this appearance, Boris Johnson had been criticized for avoiding another BBC presenter, a man named Andrew Neil, known as one of the toughest of questioners, a man who had given a very tough challenge to Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, who was interviewing other political leaders, but not Johnson, who continues to dither on showing up. In other words, risking the accusation that he was avoiding scrutiny. So Johnson had gotten the BBC, almost forced it, to accept him on this program with Andrew Marr, who is not as tough an interviewer. And we thought he would face questions on the NHS, public services, his own record of deception, even lying, including over his personal life. But of course, the London Bridge attack had occurred. So Boris Johnson had a talking point, and as expected, he immediately said, what we're going to do is we're going to end the system of early release. There will be no more early release, and all convicted terrorists will serve their full sentences. Now, there certainly is a worthwhile discussion to be had in the aftermath of this incident about the handling of murderers, about the handling of those who are serving terms for terrorist-related offenses. There is certainly time for a discussion which balances rehabilitation, justice, and security. But let's be clear what was happening here. Boris Johnson was just reaching for a soundbite, and he was doing so by exploiting and distorting the issue. You see, the system of automatic early release in the United Kingdom for convicted offenders ended in 2013. There is no system of automatic early release. Now, the system that is there is a bit complex. It relies upon the review by parole boards and by the courts of the seriousness of offenses, including of offenses that are classified as terrorism. What had happened in Usman Khan's case is that review process had released him after 8 years because the revised system had not kicked in until after he was put in prison. In other words, under the new system, he might have served longer than 8 years. This system, in other words, which was put in place, well, by a conservative government to modify early release, was the one which has been in place for several years. It was not the case that it was the evil Labour Party that was letting people go. What's even more interesting is that Boris Johnson distorted the system that is now in place and misrepresented it to imply that these political opponents, Labour, who have not been in power in 10 years, somehow were responsible for corrupting a combination of what is called extended public protection and extended detention. I won't go into this into detail, but I recommend you go to the blog of the Secret Barrister, one of the best legal analysts in the UK, to get an explanation of that system and of Usman Khan's case and why he served 8 years. And while you're there, note this, that just after Boris Johnson gave his interview, Boris Johnson's Twitter account, run by his staff, copied and pasted the Secret Barrister's blog about the current UK sentencing system. But after copying and pasting it, then distorted it to misrepresent the key points that the Secret Barrister was making. Okay, that's politics. It unsettled me. It was cheap dog whistle politics. Some would even say it is what is now called dead cat politics, a politics of distraction to get away from other issues. But it happens. The reason why I'm talking to you is what subsequently occurred to me in a radio interview on Tuesday morning. And before I tell you that, I need to add one more vital piece of information. On Monday, David Merritt, who is the father of Jack Merritt, one of the two victims of the attack at London Bridge, wrote a passionate opinion piece in The Guardian. He spoke about his son. He spoke about his life. He spoke about his pride in his son and his son's belief in, quote, a pursuit of a better world for all humanity. And he wrote that Jack Merritt would not want his death and his life being used to perpetuate an agenda of hate that he gave his everything fighting against. Now, it's the case that David Merritt never referred to Boris Johnson by name in this. He never referred to the Conservative Party in this. He spoke generally about people not exploiting his son's death to simply call for example, just locking people away, well, in perpetuity. When I was about to go on this program, which is on Talk Radio, a London-based national radio station, a program, the 6:30 to 10 o'clock program hosted by Julia HartleyBrewer, I heard Miss HartleyBrewer talking to two studio guests about this episode. I knew I was going to be interviewed about it. But as she was talking to her studio guest, she started asking why David Merritt would be writing this. Why should he have been able to pen, and why was he talking about an agenda of hate? Why was this appropriate? Why were we not focusing on what should be done with jihadi terrorists? Her term, which was also in a tweet, as well as in the program. In other words, it was David Merritt who was now to be subjected to scrutiny for supposedly speaking out. Well, for speaking out. It was David Merritt who was to be criticized, not the man who had distorted and misrepresented the attack already, Boris Johnson. So needless to say, when Julia Hartley-Brewer came to me for what is normally a 5-minute discussion, I was a bit head up. Now, I tried to maintain cool, calm, but when she again brought up the fact as to why David Merritt should have intervened in this, I kind of lost it and said, I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to use this to denounce a man who has just lost his son. I'm not going to denounce someone who spoke for trying to talk about a way of finding a better way, not just resorting to anger and hatred, which would be counterproductive. Well, she wasn't having any of it. For the next few minutes, Julia Hartley-Brewer not only continued to aim at David Merritt, but she carried water for Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson was not politicizing the issue. He merely had been asked about it on this Sunday morning program. Boris Johnson was merely expressing what was a necessary response to consider the issues in light of this attack. Boris Johnson, in other words, was acting responsibly as a prime minister. How dare I characterize this as Boris Johnson shouting, "Lock him up." And for the record, Boris Johnson might not have shouted in that Sunday morning interview, but it was "lock him up." No possibility other than full sentences being served completely for, quote, convicted terrorist. Well, that's not the end of the story, because talk radio, which likes a bit of confrontation, after one of the producers apologized to me over the encounter, and no need to. You don't have to apologize to me. I'm a big boy, and I'm not worried about what happens to me. Talk radio went viral with a tweet in which they put up the full interview, and they characterized it as David Merritt calling out an agenda of hate, and Julia Hartley-Brewer responding, "We need to have a discussion here about convicted terrorist." Now look at that juxtaposition. David Merritt, agenda of hate, being antagonistic, being provocative. Julia Hartley-Brewer, being sensible, being composed, saying we need to have a discussion here about these convicted terrorists. Yeah. I mean, the next tweet then was one, the second part of this, which was about the fact that I had said Boris Johnson was the first to politicize the issue. And Julia Hartley-Brewer said, yes, but he was the first to speak out about it. He was first to be asked about it, neutralizing what Johnson had said. Well, this is the Twitterverse, and you can expect the responses, not only in the fact that almost 3,000 people had liked those videos, but in the messages, some of whom have said some nice things about me, like lefty liberal, deluded, perhaps his kids will never be safe. Shouldn't he think about that? Yeah, whatever. But a lot of those comments continued to pile on David Merritt, that David Merritt, in fact, might be responsible for his son's death because he believed naively in rehabilitation, that David Merritt, in fact, was being dishonest because, in fact, he was a Labour Party supporter, or he was a Remainer in the Brexit debate, and that David Merritt was using his son's death. In other words, the person who was now the suspect was not Boris Johnson, or even Usman Khan, the man who committed the murders. The man who was now the suspect, at least the political suspect, was the father of the victim. I think you know where I am with this, and I'm not going to extend this video. You can go and watch the original interchange if you want to via EA Worldview. You know where I stand on decency, where I stand on responsible politics. And just to say for the record, there is a discussion which is needed in a UK criminal justice and sentencing system, which has gone through a number of changes, but is still struggling to find the balance between rehabilitation, justice, and security. There's a need for that discussion, but this was not the way to do it. And it is not the way to do it to cover water for a prime minister who quite deliberately was not out to discuss the issues, but to seize cheap electoral advantage. Because I don't want to end there, I want to go back to David Merritt and what he wrote in The Guardian. And this is what I want to leave you with. Something positive that comes out of all of this. Jack Merritt, one of the victims, along with, let us remember, Saskia Jones. Jack Merritt, according to his father, quote, would be seething at his death and his life being used to perpetuate an agenda of hate that he gave everything fighting against. We should never forget that. What Jack would want from all this is for all of us to walk through the door he has booted down in his Black Dog Martins. That door opens up a world where we do not lock up and throw away the key, where we do not give indeterminate sentences or convict people on joint enterprise, where we do not slash prison budgets, and where we focus on rehabilitation, not revenge, where we do not consistently undermine our public services, the lifeline of our nation. Jack believed in the inherent goodness of humanity and felt a deep social responsibility to protect that. Through us all, Jack marches on. Borrow his intelligence, share his drive, feel his passion, burn with his anger, and extinguish hatred with his kindness. Never give up his fight. To Jack Merritt and Saskia Jones. Now and forever. Thanks for listening, y'all. Be decent to each other. Be thoughtful. Be respectful. And we'll chat again real soon. Y'all take care now.